presentation is on fossil fuels, climate change, and poverty.
Before really getting started, let's remind ourselves of a topic that has become quite mainstream in recent years: climate change and pollution. Now, despite debates surrounding the specifics of climate change and how humans have played a role, there is no denying two very significant facts. Number one, the Earth is heating up, and quite quickly. In fact, EPA studies show, just in the United States alone, the average daily maximum temperature throughout the summer is expected to increase by up to 13 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. And number two, ozone concentration, a common pollutant, is expected to increase by varying amounts during that same time interval, with the Midwest suffering the most. These higher temperatures and reduced air quality can lead to issues in agriculture, infrastructure, and human health. But the main issue? A lot of these negative effects can be attributed to the use of fossil fuels. But just stop for a minute and think about your daily life. Fossil fuels are quite useful. We'll come back to that in a second. But this is all just looking at America. Now take into consideration the entire world, because this is not an issue any one nation can tackle alone. Just take, for example, this graph showing a global rise in water levels. Increased temperatures are causing ice caps to melt, and with less ice caps, which happen to be very reflective, there is less reflection of sunlight back to space. Less reflection means more absorption, which means higher temperatures. It's a positive feedback loop that affects everyone across the world. So what are we going to do about it? Well, global leaders have created treaties and agreements in an attempt to combat climate change, two of which are the Paris Climate Accord and the Green Climate Fund. One of the most well-known agreements regarding climate change is the Paris Climate Accord, which, in the simplest terms put forward by the 2022 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, signed in 2015, whose goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels and create a climate-neutral world by mid-century. The basis for achieving these goals are 5-year cycles of increasingly ambitious climate actions and the assistance of financial, technological, and capacity-building support to developing countries. But although this is arguably the most recent and dynamic of large-scale efforts to reduce harmful emissions in the atmosphere, it is not the first. Just a few years earlier, in 2010, the Green Climate Fund was created under the Cancun Agreements, which are widely considered to be the most comprehensive climate package to date. The fund itself proposed $100 billion a year to help support climate projects in developing nations. But as Vanderbilt's assistant professor of sociology, Patrick Greiner, points out in a 2021 discussion on colonialism, fossil fuels, and poverty, many nations have failed to deliver on this promise. While the United States and several other wealthy nations have recently recommitted to the $100 billion goal, only time will tell what the actual outcome will be. And this isn't just an issue with the Green Climate Fund. The Paris Climate Accord has its issues too. In fact, nonprofit Future of Life researcher Tucker Davey disapproves of the, quote, lack of details that fail to ensure wealthy nations follow through on the agreement. So this brings up another point. Developed nations have made all these pacts to help developing countries transition to greener energy usage, but who is going to hold them accountable for doing so, and doing so in a fair manner? After all, up to now, we have left them in the dust. These issues with fossil fuel inequality aren't just a current problem. Throughout history, wealthier countries have always dominated. Fossil fuel inequality started in the 1400s with the Age of Discovery, when Europeans realized the abundance of all sorts of natural resources held by the Global South, a term that today is synonymous with developing countries. Reliance on these nations for a variety of resources, from metals and minerals to forestry and fossil fuels, quickly increased. Just to give us an idea, in economist Utsa Patnaik's essay titled Revisiting the Drain or Transfers from India to Britain in the Context of Global Diffusion of Capitalism, it is stated that extraction from India, along with other colonies, provided for over half of Britain's domestic budget throughout the colonial period, and eventually propelled them into a period of industrialization.
Okay, but we're past colonialism now, right? Well, yes and no. Instead, it has transformed into neocolonialism, a term coined by Ghana's first prime minister. Neocolonialism is considered an indirect form of control, but, as this cartoon illustrates, it can be just as damaging. Basically, neocolonialism means political and economic leverage are used by developed countries to take advantage of Green New Deal policies that are meant to promote societal growth in a green manner. Vijay Ramachandran, the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute, provides the very recent example of Norway agreeing to a deal to increase their natural gas exports by 2 cubic meters to neighboring European countries, while at the same time lobbying the World Bank to stop all financing of natural gas projects in Africa and elsewhere as soon as 2025. But doesn't this seem a little hypocritical of Norway, especially when we are aware of the plentiful resources native to African nations that they could be using for their own development instead of adding to Norway's wealth? If you aren't yet seeing the problem, Ramachandran makes it cut and dry. Much of what is necessary for development, roads, schools, housing, reliable power, cannot be realized quickly with green power alone. And placing excessive restrictions on fossil fuels in poor nations in hopes of reducing environmental damage is quite hypocritical and essentially punishing them for something they didn't do. After all, industrialized nations have been the ones who have used high amounts of fossil fuels over the past century and created the elevated environmental risk we face currently. There's no doubt that cutting down on fossil fuels globally is key to keeping climate change to a minimum. However, we can't dismiss that from an energy point of view, fossil fuels are an efficient and easily obtainable source of energy. We have been using oil, gas, and coal for so long now that we've practically perfected the art of obtaining these materials, while we are still essentially starting from scratch with more green alternatives. As the concept of energy return on investment tells us, it takes energy to make energy. And based on an in-depth analysis of EROI values of different fossil fuels performed in 2014 by ecologist Charles Hall and his team, it appears that renewable energy sources have a much lower overall EROI. Now, as I said, it's likely this can be increased as we perfect the art of renewable energy usage. But for the immediate future, we still need fossil fuels to set the foundation for a long-term greener world. Because of this, we are currently implementing what are referred to as energy additions rather than strict energy transitions. As Patrick Greener states in his article for The Conversation, nations with greater economic inequality have used renewable energy to carry electricity to underserved populations, increasing access to electricity, but they have not reduced overall fossil fuel use. While renewable energy is and always will be the final goal, the Global South is not in a place yet where they can afford to give up fossil fuels, which are cheaper and a natural resource to the region. The policies currently in place from the Paris Climate Accord and related agreements focus solely on switching from fossil fuels to green alternatives, which in reality is only doable in the wealthy nations writing these accords. And as we have seen, sometimes these wealthy nations do everything they can to find loopholes. To combat this issue, the countries that still continue to benefit from the colonialism of their past, meaning Europe and the US, need to give back to the Global South to pull them out of poverty with the resources that were taken from them. As you can see on the graph, a decrease in poverty directly correlates to an increase in carbon emissions. You might say, wait, that's what we don't want. And you are right. Our ultimate goal is to reduce overall carbon emissions, but at what cost? Look at these numbers from a different perspective for a second. Carbon emissions directly correlate with development, again hinting at the great power of fossil fuels in aiding societal advancements. Fossil fuels have the ability to play a significant role in helping the Global South And once every nation is on equal footing, it will be much easier to actually transition to renewable energy. In conclusion, the issue of global warming cannot be addressed globally until we first deal with extreme poverty in the developing world. Fossil fuels are vital to providing the Global South with the resources to make electricity, clean water, and other basic necessities readily available to all of their communities. Our policies need to reflect the hierarchy of needs on a global scale, and then we can really put all of our time and effort into saving the planet. Thank you for listening to our